everyone. Let me tell you about the most terrifying night of my life, one that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the woods and the world. It was supposed to be an ordinary camping trip, a weekend escape from the monotony of city life. But what started as an adventure turned into a nightmare I still can't fully explain. And if you stick around, I'll tell you exactly why I've never set foot in a forest again. It began on a crisp autumn morning, the air biting but invigorating. My two best friends, Ryan and Claire, and I had planned this trip for weeks. The trail we chose was off the beaten path, a lesser-known route deep in the wilderness, promising solitude and stunning views. Locals called it Raven's Hollow, a name that now sends chills down my spine. We parked our car at the edge of the forest, loaded up our gear, and set off, joking about ghost stories and campfire tales. The first few hours were idyllic. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, the sound of birdsong surrounded us, and the crunch of leaves underfoot felt almost meditative. But then we found the trail marker, a simple wooden sign nailed to a tree. It read, Raven's Hollow, 5 miles. Beneath it, someone had scratched "Turn back" into the wood. We laughed it off, assuming it was some prank meant to scare tourists, and pressed on. That was mistake number 1. By late afternoon, the trail began to change. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining to block out the sun. A strange stillness settled over the forest. Even the birds seemed to have fallen silent. I noticed the path seemed less worn, as if no one had walked it in years. Claire joked that we were probably the first people to come this way in decades. She wasn't entirely wrong. Then came the first oddity. We stumbled upon a small pile of rocks arranged in a perfect circle in the middle of the trail. It wasn't unusual to see cairns in the wilderness, but these stones were different. Each one was carved with the symbols, runes maybe, that none of us recognized. Ryan bent down to touch one, and Claire and I yelled in unison for him to stop. He pulled his hand back, laughing nervously, and we moved on. That was mistake number 2. As dusk approached, we realized we should have reached Raven's Hollow by now. The 5 miles felt more like 15, and yet the trail stretched on. Claire pulled out her map and frowned. According to her, we should have hit a clearing by now. Ryan checked his GPS, but it couldn't get a signal. Frustration turned to unease as we pressed forward, hoping to find a suitable campsite before nightfall. When we finally stumbled into a clearing, it wasn't the one we were expecting. In the center stood an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms. At its base lay a circle of those same carved stones, larger this time, arranged around a pile of ashes. We debated setting up camp there, but something about the place felt wrong. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the forest seemed to be watching us. We decided to push on, even as darkness fell. That's when we realized the trail was no longer the same. The dirt path we'd been following had vanished, replaced by a faint, winding track that seemed to lead nowhere. Panic began to set in. Ryan suggested retracing our steps, but when we turned around, the clearing was gone. The forest had closed in behind us, the trees forming an impenetrable wall. Claire's voice cracked as she said, "This isn't possible." And then we heard it, a low, guttural whisper coming from everywhere and nowhere. At first we thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't words exactly, but it felt like a warning, or a threat. Desperate, we picked a direction and started running. The forest seemed to shift around us, the trees rearranging themselves to block our path. I tripped and fell, scraping my hands on the jagged rocks. When I looked up, Ryan and Claire were gone. My calls for them were swallowed by the oppressive silence. For the first time in my life, I felt truly alone. But I wasn't. A figure stepped out from behind a tree, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, impossibly thin, its face hidden in shadow. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. Eventually, I burst into another clearing. Ryan and Claire were there, huddled together, their faces pale with the terror. They had seen it too, they said. We didn't speak much after that. We just kept moving, driven by sheer adrenaline. Finally, as dawn broke, we stumbled back onto a familiar trail, the one leading to our car. But the strangest part, when we reached the parking lot, there was no sign of our car. The lot was empty, overgrown with weeds, as if no one had parked there in years. A rusty old sign stood nearby, warning that the trail had been closed indefinitely. It was dated 1986. To this day, I don't know what happened in Ravens Hollow. We never found our car. A park ranger eventually found us wandering the highway, and we made up a story about getting lost. But every now and then, I dream about that forest. In my dreams, the trail is waiting for me, and the whispers are louder than ever. And I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back. So if you ever come across a sign pointing to Ravens Hollow, do yourself a favor. Turn back. Story 2. It was supposed to be an ordinary night under the stars, a quiet escape into nature. But as we sat by the crackling campfire, I noticed something. Just on the edge of the flickering light, a figure was sitting silently. It wasn't one of us. They hadn't walked up or announced their presence. They were just there, sitting, watching. No sound, no movement. And that's when I realized this wasn't going to be an ordinary night after all. Camping was our thing. Me, David, and Chris had been planning this trip for weeks. We found a secluded spot deep in the woods, far away from any trails or other campers. It was perfect, quiet, remote, and untouched. By the time we set up our tents and lit the fire, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only the glow of the flames and the distant chirp of crickets. We were laughing, joking about old times, when Chris froze mid-sentence. He wasn't looking at me or David. His eyes were fixed on something behind us. I turned slowly, my stomach tightening with an unexplainable dread. There he was, a man sitting cross-legged just beyond the reach of the firelight. His face was pale, almost glowing in the faint light, and his clothes looked wrong. They were old, dirty, and out of place, like something you'd see in a history book. He didn't blink or flinch. He just stared, hands resting on his knees, his posture unnervingly still. "Hey, you okay there?" David called out, his voice trembling just enough to betray his calm facade. The man didn't respond, didn't even look at David. It was like he didn't hear him, or didn't care. Chris grabbed a flashlight and aimed it at him, but the light seemed to do nothing. It didn't reflect in his eyes, didn't cast shadows on his face. It was like the beam just stopped. "Let's just go to the tents," I whispered, trying to ignore the pit growing in my stomach. But David, always the bold one, stood up. "No way. We can't just leave him here. What if he's hurt or lost?" David walked toward him, the fire casting long, dancing shadows. When he got close, he stopped abruptly. I could see his back stiffen, his body tense. "Hey, buddy, are you?" The man tilted his head just slightly, and David stumbled backward. He turned and practically ran back to us. "His eyes," David whispered. "They're wrong. They're not human." We didn't know what to do. The man just sat there, unmoving, staring at us like we were the ones who didn't belong. We decided to retreat to the safety of our tents, thinking maybe he'd leave on his own. But the night was far from over. Hours later, I woke up to the sound of whispering, soft, almost inaudible, like wind through the trees. But there was no wind. I peeked out of my tent, and there he was, standing now, just a few feet from the fire. He hadn't moved all night, but now he was closer. His head was still tilted, his pale face illuminated by the dying embers. David and Chris were awake too, staring out of their tents with the same mix of terror and confusion. "What does he want?" Chris mouthed silently, his voice caught in his throat. The whispering grew louder, not from the man, but from everywhere. The trees, the air, even the ground seemed to hum with the low, disjointed voices. The man took a step forward, and we scrambled out of our tents, clutching flashlights and anything we could use as weapons. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking. He didn't stop. Instead, he reached the fire and crouched down. His hand moved to the embers, and he started sifting through them with his bare fingers. The flames didn't burn him. He picked up a glowing ember and held it to his face, staring at it like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. Then he spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, like it hadn't been used in years. "You're not supposed to be here." That was it. That's all he said. We grabbed what we could and bolted into the woods, leaving the tents and the fire behind. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. The next day, when we returned to retrieve our gear, everything was gone. The tents, the fire pit, even the ground we'd camped on. It was like we were never there. And the man, there was no sign of him, no footprints, no ash from the fire, just an empty clearing in the woods. To this day, I don't know who or what he was, but every time I think about going camping, I see his pale face and hear those words. "You're not supposed to be here."
Story 3. It started as a faint sound, a child's cry, distant and muffled by the thick forest around us. At first, we thought we were imagining it. After all, who would bring a child out here miles from the nearest town? But the cries grew louder, echoing through the trees. Something about the sound wasn't right. It wasn't just sorrow, it was desperation. Against our better judgment, we followed it. And that's when everything changed. We had been hiking for most of the day, trying to find the perfect campsite in this remote stretch of wilderness. It was me, my brother Ethan, and our childhood friend Lisa. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so, with only the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional call of a bird breaking the stillness. By the time we set up camp, the sun had already begun its slow descent, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. We were tired but happy, laughing as we prepared dinner over the fire. It felt like one of those moments you'd remember fondly years later. But then we heard it. It was faint at first, almost too quiet to notice, a high-pitched cry that made us all pause mid-conversation. Ethan glanced at me, his brow furrowed. "Did you hear that?" Lisa nodded, her expression uneasy. "It sounded like a kid?" We strained our ears, and there it was again, a soft, plaintive wail, carried by the wind. It seemed to come from deeper in the woods, far beyond the glow of our campfire. "Maybe someone's lost," Lisa suggested, though her voice wavered with doubt. Ethan shook his head. "Who would bring a kid out here? There's nothing for miles." Still, we couldn't ignore it. What if a child really was in trouble? Grabbing our flashlights, we decided to investigate, leaving the safety of our campfire behind. The deeper we went, the louder the cries became. They were irregular, sometimes cutting off abruptly before starting again. The forest around us seemed darker than before, the trees closing in like towering sentinels. My flashlight beam danced over twisted branches and uneven ground, but there was no sign of anyone. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small in the vastness of the forest. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped. We froze, the silence pressing down on us like a heavy weight. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe we'd scared off whatever was making the sound. But then it came back, louder and more insistent, this time from a different direction. "It's like it's moving," Lisa whispered, her grip tightening on my arm. Ethan scowled. "This doesn't feel right. We should go back." But I hesitated. Something about the cries pulled at me, like a thread I couldn't let go. Against my better judgment, I started walking again, the others reluctantly following. We found the clearing almost by accident. One moment we were pushing through dense undergrowth, and the next we were standing in an open space bathed in pale moonlight. In the center was an old, crumbling campsite, a rusted fire pit surrounded by torn tents and scattered belongings. "Is this?" Ethan began, but he didn't finish the sentence, because that's when we saw it. In the middle of the clearing stood a small figure, barely visible in the dim light. It was a child, a little girl, no older than 7 or 8, wearing a tattered dress and clutching a stuffed animal. Her back was to us, her shoulders shaking as she cried. "Hey, are you okay?" Lisa called out, stepping forward. The girl stopped crying. Slowly, she turned to face us, and my stomach dropped. Her eyes were empty, pitch black like pools of ink, and her face was pale and lifeless, as if she were made of wax. "Run," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. The girl tilted her head, a small, unnatural smile spreading across her face. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, a guttural, animalistic growl erupted from her throat. That was all it took. We turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth in blind panic. Behind us, the growling grew louder, joined by the sound of heavy, pounding footsteps. When we finally burst out of the forest and into the open, the cries stopped. The pounding footsteps ceased as if they had never been there. Gasping for breath, we didn't stop running until we reached the car. We drove away in silence, the events of the night replaying in our minds. The next morning, I couldn't resist looking up the area we had camped in. What I found chilled me to the bone. Years ago, a family had gone missing in that forest. Their campsite had been found abandoned, with no trace of the parents or their young daughter. Some say the girl still wanders those woods, crying for help, luring the unwary to their doom. I don't know what we saw that night, but one thing is certain: I'll never ignore the sound of crying in the woods again. And if you ever hear it, do yourself a favor. Don't follow it. Story 4. There's a particular kind of fear that creeps in when you realize you're not alone, when you feel eyes on you but can't find their source. That's the fear that haunted us on that camping trip. The fear that turned what should have been a weekend of laughter and campfire stories into a nightmare we still can't explain. It started small, missing gear, odd noises, but by the time we understood what was happening, it was far too late to leave. I've always loved the outdoors. Fresh air, quiet trails, the sense of escape from the chaos of daily life. My friends Jake, Sarah, and I had been planning this trip for months, a weekend in the remote Pinewood Forest, far from cell service and crowded campsites. It was supposed to be perfect. We arrived on a crisp Friday afternoon, the late summer sun casting golden light through the trees. Our campsite was idyllic, a flat clearing surrounded by towering pines with just enough space for our tents and a fire pit. We laughed as we set up camp, joking about how we'd survive without our phones and vowing to make this a tradition. The first night was uneventful, almost magical. The fire crackled as we roasted marshmallows and swapped stories, the stars above so bright they seemed unreal. We went to bed early, eager to hike the nearby trails in the morning. It wasn't until the second day that things started to feel off. It began with small, almost dismissible things. Jake couldn't find his water bottle, even though he swore he left it by the fire. Sarah's hiking boots were damp, despite being under the rainfly of her tent. I found my flashlight in the dirt outside my tent, the batteries dead, even though I'd replaced them the day before. "Must be raccoons," Jake said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Raccoons don't open tent zippers," Sarah muttered, rubbing her arms as if to ward off a chill. We shrugged it off, determined not to let anything ruin our weekend. The hike was beautiful, the trails winding through dense forest and leading to a stunning overlook of the valley below. For a while, I forgot about the strange occurrences. But when we returned to camp that evening, the unease returned with a vengeance. Someone or something had been there. The firewood we'd stacked was scattered across the clearing. My tent flap was unzipped, and Sarah's sleeping bag was halfway out as if it had been dragged. Jake's pocket knife was stuck in a tree trunk, its blade embedded so deep it looked like it had been hammered in. "Okay, this isn't funny," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It's probably just some kids messing with us," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe they saw our cars and thought it'd be funny to scare us." "Then where are they now?" I asked, my eyes scanning the tree line. The forest felt too quiet, as if the usual hum of wildlife had been silenced. That night, none of us slept well. I lay in my tent, listening to every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint shuffle outside my tent. My heart raced as I held my breath, straining to hear more. Then came the whisper. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a low, almost inaudible sound, like someone murmuring just outside the fabric of my tent. I froze, my hand clutching the flashlight with its useless batteries. The whispering stopped abruptly, and I thought maybe I'd imagined it. But then Sarah screamed. We tumbled out of our tents, flashlights sweeping the dark clearing. Sarah was standing by the fire pit, her face pale. "Someone was watching me," she said, her voice shaking. I woke up and saw a face just outside the tent. Jake tried to calm her, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We all agreed to stay by the fire for the rest of the night, huddled together as the flames flickered weakly. Around 3 a.m., Jake noticed it. Footprints in the dirt circling the campsite. Bare footprints, too large to be ours and too fresh to be old. "Maybe it's an animal," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Animals don't whisper," Sarah snapped, tears streaming down her face. By dawn, we decided to pack up and leave. None of us said it out loud, but we all felt it, the sense of being watched, of being followed. As we loaded our gear into the car, I glanced back at the campsite one last time. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the morning mist, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. It didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, watching. I didn't say anything. I just climbed into the car and we drove away in silence. Later, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was another camper or a park ranger. But deep down, I know the truth. Whoever or whatever was watching us that weekend wasn't human. Pinewood Forest is beautiful, but I'll never go back. And if you ever decide to camp there, do yourself a favor. Don't stay after dark.